au nom de l'Université de Lausanne et de sa faculté des hautes études commerciales, j'aimerais bien vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette édition des conférences Walras-Pareto. Good evening. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of University of Lausanne and its Faculty of Business and Economics here at this edition of the Walras-Pareto Conference. Today, we are here to embark on a journey. It's a journey into a new continent, the continent of networks. It's a strange world. It's a world that talks about who we know and why, and how that affects us. And it's an unknown world to us, or somewhat known world to some of us, because it's a very natural phenomenon that we're connected to other people. But this journey here, we're not doing it alone. We have among us the cartographer of the world of networks. This is the person who mapped the major roads, who found many answers to important questions. And this is Professor Matthew Jackson. Came all the way from Stanford University. A big round of applause for Matthew. So I'm very pleased about the fact that we're all here today. We're here to look into this new world, to find out more, and to really see, what is it we know about networks, and what is it we don't know about networks in the second part. So I'm very happy to welcome you all to this conference to this edition of the Walras-Pareto Conference. And I would like to give the word now to Dominic Groner. And Dominic Groner has, together with Bettina Klaus, organized all of this conference.
Merci beaucoup, Raphaël. Donc, bienvenue à tous. Alors, c'est un grand plaisir d'avoir cette conférence. Donc, on a chaque deuxième année, tous les 2 ans, on a cette conférence. La dernière fois, c'était le professeur Aguillon qui est venu. Et puis, donc, chaque fois, on invite des très gros calibres, des immenses vedettes de notre discipline. Matthew Jackson fait partie de ces tout grands économistes de notre époque. Donc, Matthew Jackson, il est professeur à l'Université de Stanford. Il est éditeur de plusieurs grands journaux scientifiques. Il a gagné de nombreux prix, des doctorats honoris causa. Et puis, il est vraiment un des pionniers, comme disait Raphaël, de cette science des networks, des réseaux de contacts. Et puis, c'est un monde fascinant qui peut vraiment expliquer plein de choses dans toutes les sous-disciplines de l'économie et aussi dans d'autres disciplines. Donc, c'est un très grand plaisir. Nous avons aussi, nous souhaitons la bienvenue à nos panélistes, aussi des personnages clés de la Suisse. Donc, on a Martin Brunswick-Graf qui est là, Bernard Rüeger, Alizé de Tonac, Roger Norman et André Schneider. Et ça sera le modérateur Alain Janet qui va après les introduire en beaucoup plus de détails. Donc voilà, j'aimerais encore une fois remercier pour le soutien de l'Université de Lausanne, de la Faculté des HEC et de notre département, de nos collègues en économie qui nous aident à financer cet événement. Et puis encore cordialement, vous souhaitez la bienvenue à tous. Merci beaucoup d'être là. Alors je donne la parole au professeur Jackson.
Thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to be part of such an illustrious group, and I want to thank HEC for inviting me, and especially Bettina and Dominique for arranging all the details. It's really been wonderful. So today I'm going to take you through, as they said, a journey, and it'll be a journey that the idea is here to point out some very simple and robust factors of networks that help us understand our lives. And I'm going to start So this is coming out of a book that I wrote recently called The Human Network. And I'm going to start by showing you a high school. And what I'm going to do is take you through two different high schools. The first high school is a fictional high school. This is each little dot here on the screen that you see before you is a student, and each connection between two students is a friendship. And in particular, in the data set, this is going to represent the fact that they did at least 3 things together in a given week. So they studied together, they went to lunch together, they did sports together. So these are friendships, close friendships. And what I've done is first I'm going to show you a computer-generated random network, and then I'm going to show you the real network, the actual network from the data set. So the first one up here is a randomly generated network. It's 255 students, and it has exactly the same number of friendships that exist in the real data. But here, these have just been randomly placed. So it looks like a giant bowl of spaghetti. There's no real pattern to it. And this was drawn by what's known as a spring algorithm. So the algorithm tries to find the patterns in the data, and it does so by taking 2 nodes, two people, and if they're friends, it moves them closer together, and if they're not, it pulls them further apart. Okay, so this is the fictional high school. And now I'm going to show you the real one, and I want you to sort of notice what the differences are. So this is the real high school. And this is from a study which was known as the Ad Health data set. And there's several things to notice about it, and I want to point out 2. First of all, you'll notice that some of the people don't have any friendships at all in this. Right? So there's more inequality in terms of the friendships. So if you go back to the randomly generated one, everybody in that network happened to have at least one friendship. Some had more, some had less, but there wasn't that big a spread. When you go to the real high school, you see more inequality in the social structure. You see more people with 0 friendships, and you see some people with many friendships. So there's going to be a greater difference. This is in the networks literature, this is what's known as fat tails. You've got more distribution in terms of people with very few connections and people with many connections. The other is that you begin to see a split in the network. Okay? So there's a group up here which is completely disconnected from the group down here. And this is what's known as homophily, and I'll show you in a moment why it's known as homophily. So here, what I've done is now I've colored the nodes, and I've colored them by race. So these are self-reported races, and in this particular high school, 38% of the students are black, so these are the blue nodes. A little more than 50% of the students are white, these are the yellow nodes, and then there were a group of Hispanic students, a small percentage of Hispanic students, and you can see them as the red nodes. And you can see that essentially this network splits in 2. And this was part of this is part of the Ad Health data set, which was a study conducted by the US government. This is from a study I did on this with Sergio Curarini and Paulo Pin, and trying to understand exactly how the students were segregating themselves. But the idea originally for the government was we'd like to put together high schools that are well integrated. And you can put together high schools that are well integrated on paper, but then when you actually look inside and you look at the friendships, they're completely segregated in this case. And their attempt was to build bigger and bigger high schools to produce more mixed high schools, but then the friendships fractured more within when they got to larger high schools. So we're going to talk about, this is what's known as homophily, so love of same. So basically, people tend to associate with other people who have similar characteristics. And we'll talk in more detail about that because that's going to be an important underpinning of understanding a whole series of things from inequality to immobility to polarization. So this underlies a lot of current issues. But I want to take you through just a couple of other things first. This is another picture from the same high school. Sorry, not the same high school in particular, but the same data set, the Ad Health data set. And now these are also students, but instead of colored by race, now they're colored by gender. And instead of friendships where people are doing several things together, these are romantic and sexual relationships that were reported during the 18-month period of the study. Okay? And what you notice about this graph, there's fewer connections in this graph, so it's not quite as connected as this one is. But still, you begin to see the patterns that are there in the data. And in particular, you see what's known as a giant component. So you see a group of nodes that are all able to reach each other via a path. And in this kind of, this is important for understanding structures of diffusion, contagion. So if you want to understand sexually transmitted diseases, if you want to understand how people come to certain beliefs, understanding what these structures look like is important. And one thing to point out here is even though many of these people only have one or two relationships, they're still exposed to a large percentage of the population via connections and paths in the network. And so understanding these structures can be very powerful in understanding things like contagion, vaccination policies, but also how ideas transmit and so forth when you begin to look at the underlying structures of these networks. Okay, so let's go back for a moment to this first picture of the high school. And the idea here that there's this inequality in terms of how many connections people have. And I want to talk about one of the main implications of this, which is what's known as the friendship paradox. So if you look at the idea here that some people are very well connected and other people have very few connections, the friendship paradox refers to a very simple phenomenon, which is that your friends, on average, are more popular than you are. Okay, and that sounds kind of paradoxical, why it's called the friendship paradox, but the fact is a very simple explanation behind it. So the idea that your friends are more popular than you are, on average, the people who have the most friendships are going to be the people who are seen by the most other people as friends. So if somebody has 10 friendships and somebody else has one, the person with 10 friendships is going to appear in 10 people's friendship circles and have a lot of influence. The person with one friend has relatively lower influence. Okay? So why is that important? Well, it turns out that that's important because people who have more friends and are more popular behave systematically differently from people who have fewer friendships. And so if we're looking at our friends in order to figure out what norms of societal behavior are, then we're overcounting the popular people and undercounting the less popular people. And that gives us a biased view of what normal behavior is. And just to give you an example of that, there have been several studies of things like drug use among teens, drinking among teens, and you look at the age at which people first try things. So for instance, each additional friend makes it 6% more likely that someone has tried alcohol by the time they're becoming a teenager. So, the people who are more popular tend to be more socially influenced. There's a series of reasons that they're involved in more social activities, and they exhibit different behaviors, and then that gives rise to beliefs and so forth that can be distorted by the society. So understanding this kind of inequality in terms of network connections ends up having implications for what people's beliefs are and how they behave. Okay, I want to go back to this idea of homophily, and I want to go through just different illustrations of it and then some of the implications of it. So here is a picture of another network, very different one from the EdHealth. This is one that I've been in a study I've been involved with for the last decade with some people from MIT. And in particular, what we're looking at now, this is a village in southern India, in Karnataka, so near Bangalore. This is a village, and each node now, instead of a person, is a household. And the particular network we're looking at is the network of people borrowing and lending kerosene and rice with each other. And this is something, these are relatively poor villages, and this is a basic thing that they do every day. They have to borrow things, so they're borrowing kerosene and rice back and forth. And what the color coding is in this particular network is by caste. So in particular, the red dots are what are known as the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So these are the relatively disadvantaged caste groups in India. And the blue squares are the relatively advantaged castes. So these are what are known as the otherwise backward castes and the general merit or forward castes. And here again, you can begin to see that the structure of friendships is, or in this case, interactions, is very heavily caste-based. And that might not be surprising, but it has large consequences. So in this particular study, what we were trying to do was figure out how to get microfinance products into the hands of the households. And so we were working with a bank in order to try and get information about microfinance out, and they were doing it by word of mouth. And so you can begin to see if they were telling a few key people that in the village, we're a bank, we're going to come and offer loans, and we'd like you to tell your friends about it, and then we'll come back in a few weeks and see who's here and offer some microfinance. And what would happen is, in cases where they happen to get good dispersion of the information across different caste groups, they would have much better diffusion than in situations where all the seeds, the initial people that they told about the product and had to spread news, all happened to be in one caste group. So even though this is a relatively small village, and these are people who have lived with each other their whole lives, they interact very infrequently across these groups. And so that can be almost paralyzing. And in this case, you have this 15 times more likely to be interacting with somebody inside your own caste group than across. And you can begin to make additional cuts in this graph. So for instance, in this particular village, the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes basically don't interact with each other at all. So even though they're both in a disadvantaged group, there's reasons in this case that they don't interact with each other. They have very different political bases, very different beliefs, norms, culture, and information can be stuck in one part that doesn't get to the other part of the graph. So this kind of homophily and strong interaction structure can have important consequences. Now, obviously, this exists pretty much in all societies. You can see it by age, you can see it by religion, profession, etc. In Switzerland, you begin to see segmentations where people are speaking different languages in different parts of the country, and there's going to be strong affiliations by language. Where people move, where they immigrate into Switzerland is going to be determined partly by their language background and what groups are available, and where Portuguese people live in Switzerland determines where new immigrants come. And you'll see this kind of bunching and coagulation in terms of the network structure. Okay, I want to spend a little time talking about some of the economics behind the consequences of this and how we can begin to think about economic policies going forward and what kinds of things are important in terms of improving people's lives in light of this kind of homophily, which we see quite frequently. And what I want to start with is just some background on inequality and immobility. And just to show you some figures, first of all, I'll just show you this is a Gini Coefficients. So these are measures of inequality, and this is basically a simple measure of inequality where what you do is think of the following experiment. Take two people from a society and then compare their incomes. And if they have the same income, then there's zero difference. If the wealthier person has 100% more income than the poor person, then there's 100% difference. And so here a factor of 1 would mean that on average, every time you pulled two people from the population, the wealthier person would have 100% more income than the poorer person. A level of 0 means that there's nothing, no difference, no inequality. And so here you see the Gini coefficients over time, for 3 different countries. So I just plotted the USA, China, and UK. I'll show you Switzerland has a shorter time horizon in terms of data, but I'll show you some of the data in a moment. But basically, people have been talking about rising inequality. There's many different measures of it, but you can see it pretty clearly here. So for instance, the US is hitting points we have not seen since the Great Depression. So this is 1930. You've seen the Great Depression was sort of a peak in inequality, and we're getting back to that level. You're seeing the same thing happen in China. Actually, it was low at the Great Depression, but now it's rising. UK has gone up. When you look at Switzerland has gone up. It's come down a little bit, sort of bouncing around. But basically, most countries are experiencing some levels of increase in inequality, and it depends on. In this case, this is a slightly different measure. Why I didn't put it on the earlier graph. This is disposable income. The other one was gross income. But part of what's happening and part of the reason to understand why we're seeing more widespread changes in terms of different groups, and I'll tie that back to the separations that we see in the social networks in a moment, But one thing that's happening is technology is changing the way in which people are productive. And so if you look over time, this is looking at how many hours it takes to produce goods in a society. And this is just looking at non-farm business goods. So it's pretty much a measure of all the goods in a society that aren't agricultural. And just ask how many hours you need to produce the same amount of product. And there's always arguments about how exactly to measure this, but let's just take this measure as given. So here we go back to just after the Second World War, and then we'll come up through about 2015. And you can see that we've dropped by a factor of roughly 5. So it takes, productivity has increased dramatically. But what's important about that is that productivity is having different impacts on different parts of the labor force. So if you have an advanced degree, if you've been educated, have a university degree, if you can computer program, if you've studied machine learning, if you're in management, these are the kinds of jobs where computers are actually improving people's productivity and enhancing it. So it amplifies your ability to produce things. Whereas instead, if you're somebody who worked in a warehouse, you worked in retail, you worked as a travel agent, these kinds of things, you're basically being displaced by robots, by productive software. These kinds of things are sort of displacing people with low skill levels and low levels of education and enhancing people with high skill levels. And what that does is that produces a premium in terms of the benefits to going to university and to getting educated. And so here, this is just looking at the college wage premium over time, and you see it going from, it used to be in the early 1960s that having a college degree made you about 50%, increased your wages by about 50%. In fact, now, if you go to 2019, it's over 100% increase. So we've more than doubled the relative size of this ratio, and that's happening because of this, sort of worldwide change in technology, which is changing the relative advantages to being in low-skilled and high-skilled labor. Okay, so when we begin to think about this has important consequences when we come back to the social structure, and one of them I'm going to illustrate on this picture. And Switzerland actually has an interesting place in this picture. So this is what's known as the Gaspee Curve. The Gaspee Curve was popularized in a speech by Alan Kruger to Barack Obama in 2012. And what the Gaspee Curve does is it plots two different things. It plots inequality on one axis. So here we're looking at inequality, these Gini indices. And on the other axis, it's plotting immobility. And so immobility is referring to the correlation between parents' income and children's income. So think about, if I have wealthy parents, do I end up being wealthy or poor? If I have poor parents, do I end up being wealthy or poor? A correlation of 1 means whatever happened to my parents happens to me. A correlation of 0 means we've got a freely mobile society and your destiny is not determined by your parents. And what's the interesting relationship here is there tends to be a positive relationship between the societies that have the most inequality and the most immobility. Switzerland actually is pretty far. It's high on the immobility level, relatively lower on the inequality level. And partly that's because of the state system for redistribution means that people do relatively well on the inequality scale, but the chance that you're going to end up looking a lot like your parents is fairly high. Why is this important? I think, trying to understand immobility means if we have a lot of immobility, it means that inequality is not happening just at random because some people happen to get a little bit luckier or not. It means that there's structural issues which are pushing people to stay in certain parts of society, and this gets back to the homophily. And I want to talk about sort of, a couple of reasons that this happens. And one of the basic reasons that we end up having strong immobility gets back to the homophily. And when you look at opportunities to become employed, you look at how people get their jobs, there have been a number of studies, this goes back to the 1950s, that have really detailed how people get jobs through connections. So being referred is very important in getting a job. And it's not just important for executives or academics. it's also important even at low levels of skill. So people, for instance, if you, in the book I talk about an example where people are sorting recycling goods. So you sit there on a line and recycling stuff comes back. You pick out the paper and you put it in a paper bin, you put the plastic in a plastic bin. They rely 100% on referrals from their current employees to attract new employees. And why is that? Well, they're taking advantage of the homophily. They want to find people that are willing to stand there and do this for low wages, for long periods of time, and they know that their current employees have friends that look a lot like them, and so they rely on that kind of referral to get workers who they know they can rely on to stay in the job and to actually do the job. And so they have this, so homophily actually plays into the referrals, but also the referrals mean now if I'm fairly poor, I'm going to have connections to people working on a recycling line. I'm not going to have connections to people in a more attractive business. It's going to be harder for me to move ahead. And that also plays through in terms of the information I have and a whole series of things. Now, it's very difficult to show, one thing that social scientists worry about quite a bit, and especially economists these days, is showing that there's actually a causal relationship between this. So if you want to say, does the employment of my friends really matter to me? That's a hard thing to measure. And why is it hard to measure? Well, it's hard to measure because my friends being employed and me being employed, it might be that we met through our employment. Or it might be that if they're unemployed and I'm unemployed, it's because I'm hanging around and I'm going to hang around with other unemployed people. So just seeing correlations between people's employment and so forth doesn't necessarily mean that that the network is responsible for that. So I'll mention a couple of studies that are informative on this. One was a fascinating study done by a man named Ron Lashever. And what he looked at was the draft in the First World War in 1917. So in 1917, the U.S. Army started at about 300,000 people, and by 1918, it was 4 million people. And the way that they put the army together was by randomly drawing people. Everybody was assigned a number, and then you took that random number and you put those people together in a company. They put them together in 100-person companies. And then these people went off to war together. And what Ron did was years later, he looked at the outcomes that they had in terms of their employment. And since these were randomly formed groups, you could be pretty sure that these friendships were not chosen by the people. They were just there because you got put in this company and you were randomly put together with some group of people who could be completely different from yourself. And what he showed was if you increased the employment of my friends by 10%, you increased my employment by 4% on average. So there's a 40% spillover just in terms of the employment, the post-war employment of these groups. And so how well my group does, random groups that were almost exactly the same in terms of random composition ended up having very different outcomes depending on whether some of them got luckier and had access to jobs and other ones didn't. That would filter through the group and you would get these correlations. Another study which has tried to put a number on the impact of this is what's known as the Moving to Opportunity study. This was a study that was done by the U.S. government, and it was done in the mid-1990s. And what they did was they took a series of poor families, about 4,500 families, a little more than that, and they put them into 3 different groups. One group, they gave vouchers to pay for housing, and they said you can only use this voucher if you move away from this poor neighborhood. These were people in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, and you have to move to a wealthy neighborhood. So we'll take you from this neighborhood, and if you move to this neighborhood, we'll pay for all your housing. Okay, so that was one group. Another group, they gave the same vouchers, but they didn't ask them to move. You could use the voucher just to pay for your rent. And a third group, they didn't give anything to. And then they tracked these people over time. And when you look more than a decade later, so this was work that was done by Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, and Larry Katz. What they did is they eventually looked at the income, and other health and educational variables in terms of people's outcomes, and they estimated that if you were an 8-year-old whose family moved from the poor neighborhood to the wealthier neighborhood, you had a lifetime earnings change of about $300,000. So in terms of Swiss francs, that would be roughly, I guess in today's exchange rates, 300,000 Swiss francs. So roughly, you were increasing that by an enormous amount in terms of their lifetime earnings just by having them move from one neighborhood to another when they're 8-year-old. Interestingly enough, if you moved an 18-year-old from one neighborhood to another, it made no difference. So the 18-year-olds who moved, basically at that point, their friendships were already intact. They'd already sort of set well along their lives, and there was very little impact. But there was impact in terms of income. They were sixth more likely to, the 8-year-olds were sixth more likely to end up in college. They ended up being less likely to be single parents, less likely to be in jail. There's a whole series of things which they sort of did better on. So, this sort of means that you're closely tied to the outcomes of those people around you, and that's sort of difficult in terms of social mobility. It means that a whole group of people who are relatively unemployed or relatively disadvantaged in some way can end up staying that way. Okay. I want to talk about another aspect of this kind of social structure that I think is very salient in these days, in the modern times. When we talk about how people form opinions, we talk about polarization, we talk about social learning, the network structure makes a big difference. And I want to start with just a quick fact which sort of sets the stage for how a society can function, and then we can talk about how they do function. And the fact goes back to a study that was done in 1907 by Sir Francis Galton. And this was in the UK, then in England. And what he was looking at was, he was at a fair, and people were there guessing the weight of an ox. So there was an ox there. You got to guess how heavy the ox was. Okay. So there were 787 entries into this thing, and then he looked at all the entries of how heavy the ox was. And the sort of remarkable thing was, the actual ox weighed 1,198 pounds, and the average guess among the society was 1,197 pounds. So if you took, this was what's known as vox populi, the wisdom of the crowds, the idea was that collectively people were very, very accurate. So if you looked at the average in society and you could take all those people and average their opinions, it was right on the money. And this is the idea behind efficient markets and all kinds of things. There's a lot of different things that we use and say, the crowd can be quite wise. So what's difficult about this is that information is very widely spread. It's spread among a number of people. And generally, when we're trying to form opinions about things, say, is there climate change? Is it good to vaccinate my child, and so forth? We can't go out to the society and average all those opinions. We're talking to people around us. We're looking at certain media that we have connections to for various reasons. So we're not getting that broad, societal-wide view. We're getting a much narrower view. And I want to talk about sort of, some of the things that are entering into that and how it comes back to networks. So one of the things I think to sort of basically understand about this is, when we think about the human species, we want to say, okay, somehow humans seem different than other animal species. We seem to have been more successful in, according to some variety of measures. And if you think about, we have language, we communicate with each other, we teach our young, we care for our young in groups. You can find species that do all of those things. But what really sets humans apart is the ability for abstract communication. And what I mean by that is, I can describe, so maybe I know a friend in San Francisco who has never been to Lausanne. I can go home and I can explain what my trip to Lausanne was like. And that person can actually envision and have some picture of what Lausanne is like and have some vicarious experience and begin to understand that. And this kind of communication is a very valuable tool because it helps us learn and conceptualize and teach each other things at a level that allows us to operate much more powerfully than if we all had to learn things by personal experience. So we could teach each other, but we had to try everything ourselves. So this kind of thing is really powerful. But it also makes us quite vulnerable. and it makes us vulnerable to false beliefs. So we can believe things even not having experienced them, whether they're true or not. So this means that we're sort of relying on other people, relying on that information to form our opinions and form our beliefs. And so I think, trying to understand how networks play into this, there's a series of different things that become important about networks to sort of inform us as to how this is working and why it is that people can end up with systematically biased beliefs. The first thing is the one that we already talked about, the friendship paradox. Right? So I'm overweighting certain individuals. Those people who are very popular and well-connected can have a disproportionate impact on what people do. When you get to something like Twitter, this is outsized, right? There's people with millions of followers, and they're reaching huge numbers of people and influencing their beliefs instantaneously. Others who might actually have much more accurate information about things can actually be heard by very few. So one is this idea of friendship paradox. Another is this basic structure of homophily. And what that means is we're often communicating with people who are very similar to ourselves. So, for instance, they might have similar background and similar ways of thinking about the world. They might be people who end up guessing almost the same weight for the ox as I do. And so if I'm only talking to other people who have the same way of viewing the world, then I'm not getting the full spectrum of views. I'm getting that narrower set of views. So the homophily plays very importantly into this. And then another aspect of this is that in forming complex opinions, so it's not just news where I happen to know whether something is true or not. If I have to actually form an opinion about something that takes real thought, that can involve reinforcement. I need to hear from people. I need to hear from a lot of people. It takes me a while to really form a detailed opinion. And so that means that now I'm relying very heavily on a biased group, a small group of the overall network, and that ends up causing difficulties in terms of my ability to sort of process the broader societal learning. And finally, I think one thing that's really important that we overlook quite a bit, and this is something that I've become quite cognizant of sort of living in a network as a researcher now, we do a lot of double counting. So what do I mean by that? So imagine that a new movie comes out, and I hear from 4 friends that they've heard that this is a great movie. Okay, so my tendency as a human is to count that as 4 different pieces of information and say, this is, I'm starting to hear from lots of people that this is true, and the more people I hear from, the more I believe it's true. Well, it could be that they all read the same review, right? There was one review that came out that said it was a really good movie. We all said that same piece, and so as it filters through, we're actually very poor at counting back and seeing what the sources are and being able to distinguish the fact that we're hearing multiple pieces of information that all had the same original source. And this is something that's very difficult to do. And, as a person, one way we can combat this is when people tell you things, ask about the source. Ask where they got that information from. Ask how they got it. Ask why they came to the beliefs they did. And the more inquisitive we are about these things, the more we can begin to discern whether we're hearing the same information, whether we're doing double counting. And we can combat homophily on a personal level just by being more cognizant and moving across groups. Okay, so I want to spend just a last few minutes here on how networks are changing and what kinds of changes we're seeing in them. And I think a nice way to visualize, obviously world's globalizing, where technology is changing the way we're connected. I'll just take you a few pictures of how these things are changing. And what I want to start with is what's known as the ATOP data set. And actually there's several researchers here at HEC who are working on using this data set. This is one of the few data sets that goes back a couple of centuries. And what these are now is countries. So each one of these little points is a country. And there's a line between 2 of them if they had some kind of military alliance. I won't go into the details, but think of these as some agreement to not attack each other, to help each other out. Okay, so you've got these alliances, and I'll just take you through decade by decade. So we'll start right after the Napoleonic Wars. And we go through and we see that the network bounces around a bit. This is from a paper I wrote with Stephen Nye. So we go through, get to the 1860s. 1870s were kind of a rough period. Things disintegrated quite a bit. 1880s, 90s, things bounce around quite a bit. First World War, between the wars, Second World War, and now we get to the post-war period. And you can begin to see things get denser, 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 and denser. You can put in your favorite country. But basically what have happened, this network has changed in two dramatic ways. Pre-1950s, countries had on average 2.5 partners. Now they have more than 10.5 partners. Pre-1950s, if you looked at a given alliance and asked, will it still be here 5 years later, the chance was about 2/3 that it would still be there. Now it's about 95%. So you're seeing an increase in the density, and you're seeing these alliances last longer. So they're more cemented. And in this study, what we did is we looked at the reasons underpinning this, and these correlate very heavily with trade patterns. So if two countries trade with each other, they basically are allied with each other, and regardless of their political ideologies and so forth, they're much more likely to be allies. What's some of the consequences of that? Well, this is one of the consequences, and here I'll talk just in terms of correlations, and then you can say a little bit about this. So here what I've plotted out is the incidence of wars over time. So this is just looking in the world. Look at how many wars there are in a given period of time. So take two countries, are they at war? What's the fraction of countries that are at war with each other? And it bounces around, countries fight, then they get exhausted, they go back and forth, we have world wars and so forth. And then you get to post-1950, and boom, it's much flatter. We've still had fairly extensive wars. You have the Congo wars. You've had what's going on in the Middle East. So there have been wars, but relatively in terms of the numbers, they're down dramatically. And this looks like about a factor of 1/10 to what they were before. And largely, when you begin to correlate this, and so what we looked at in this paper was sort of the network structures and trying to predict how that worked with this. Effectively, countries that are trading with each other don't go to war with each other. So, half a standard deviation increase in the amount of trade that two countries have is 17 times less likely that they're going to go to war with each other. And so when you begin to see trade costs have gone down, the world is globalizing, this means that there's a lot more trade, and that begins to give us a more peaceful world. And this happens even if you control for whether a government is democratic, non-democratic, whether they have nuclear power, et cetera. If they trade together, they find a way not to go to war with each other. So this sort of says, one good thing about the world in terms of globalization means we're entering the most peaceful period we've ever seen. We've also entered the most wealthy period in terms of global wealth. The poverty rate has dropped from 40% to less than 10%. So if you look at the fraction of people that lived below the poverty line in 1980, it was more than 40%. Now it's less than 10%. But we're nowhere near eliminating poverty, but we've actually seen a great improvement due to the increased trade and globalization. But along with this has come other kinds of impacts. And the other kinds of changes that we're seeing, I just want to sort of point out, when we think about the networks that we're looking at, there can be conflicting patterns at the same time. So this one is we're connected with more people at greater distances. We're able to trade with more people. We're able to communicate with more people. This can happen overnight. It can happen faster. So the whole world's becoming more wired. But at the same time as becoming more wired, it's also possible that it can become more segregated and more homophilistic. And how does that happen? Well, we have these basic tendencies to want to connect with other people who are similar to ourselves. And when we think about things like the internet and social platforms, those allow us to be more choosy in terms of who we connect with. We can see people, we can find people that have similar views, we can find media that express views that are very similar to ourselves. We can begin to search for that and make those connections. And I think you can begin to look at how people are becoming connected. This is a graph that's actually from a fun study recently. This is Michael Rosenfeld, who's also at Stanford and a group that he runs. And what we're looking at here is couples. They were surveying couples, and they were asking, how did you first meet? So what was the way in which they first met? And this just looks over time, and it's pretty striking. You can see what's happening in terms of the graph. Via friends has gone down, family, etc. The one that's just gone through the roof is online. This is heterosexual couples. If you actually look at homosexual couples, it happened earlier and with a steeper incline. But basically, this is saying that, a lot more people are actually meeting through dating apps or through some sort of app. And this has consequences, right? Because now they're not necessarily choosing their partners by chance. They're choosing them partly based on an algorithm and explicit information. If you look at dating services and you look at how people make choices, they tend to choose people with similar income levels, similar education levels, similar backgrounds, similar religion. So there's a whole series of things that then get amplified in terms of how the algorithms are connecting people. And this isn't just in terms of dating. This can also be showing you the feed that you want to see on your social media sites or whichever newspaper you're reading. A whole series of things are happening behind the scenes that can make this world become more densely connected, but more segregated at the same time. And just to talk about some of the implications of this, I'll just end with one figure that comes from the U.S. Senate. And this is, I think, an informative one just from the picture. This is code I got from a computer scientist named Renzo Lucioni. And what this is now, each one of these people is a senator, U.S. senator. And there's a connection between two of them if they agreed more than they disagreed in terms of votes. So if they voted the same way on at least 50% of the bills, then they're connected. We'll say that they're agreeing with each other. And if they're not connected, it means that they disagreed more than they agreed. Okay, and these are just color-coded by Republican and Democrats. And this is 1990. And in 1990, and again, this is drawn by a Spring algorithm, so what it does is it puts the senators in positions to try and put together the ones that are most closely connected and push the ones to the extremes that are less closely connected. So the most extreme Republicans are over here, the most extreme Democrats, and then the people that sort of vote across the aisle are in the middle. This is 1990, and 82% of the senators were linked. This is 2015. So this is actually before the Trump was elected, but you can begin to see that there's a lot more segmentation that's occurred here. So now you've got only 53% that are linked, and most of those links are happening within parties. So when people are talking about polarization, there's a sense in which you can really see it. It's not just something that's been invented by the media. There's different measures by which people are measuring polarization. You can see it's there. And I think it's a result of these, you've got a bunch of currents all at the same time, where you've got these underlying economic factors pushing people apart in terms of their possible earnings. You've got immobility, so that means that they're stuck in these different groups. And then you've got your lot, which is really tied in your beliefs and your opinions and what you hear tied to these groups. And you've got algorithms which are helping improve this in terms of amplify it in terms of forcing more people in, and then you end up, with more and more splits. So I think, one thing I can say as a network scientist, there's probably no more fascinating time to be alive in terms of all the data and the different things that are going on, but it's also can be both good news and troubling news for us as human beings in terms of the various changes that we're seeing in our society as a result of a lot of these technological forces at the same time. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think it's time to have a great discussion with the panel. So.